In 1986, in a town in Connecticut, a stewardess went missing during a severe snowstorm.
All of a sudden, we have a missing mother of three. It was quite startling.
The police eventually discovered that she was brutally murdered, but there was a serious lack of evidence.
They had no murder weapon, they had no crime scene, they had no witnesses.
What started out as a missing persons case would become one of the most shocking murders in the history of Connecticut. As well as the police, others also chronicled the investigation on film, on paper, and on tape. Through their lenses, they captured the story of the Woodchipper wife killer. November 1986, Newtown in Connecticut. This peaceful New England town is home to the many commuters who prefer to live away from the hustle and bustle of New York City.
Newtown, Connecticut in the 1980s was a very quiet community, very rural. It's hilly, it's wooded, it has lakes and streams, open meadows, a great place to live. It had wonderful schools, nice atmosphere, very safe place for you to raise your family.
Very quiet. They never had hardly any crime at all.
Predominantly, the biggest crimes were property crimes, probably house burglaries, daytime house burglaries.
There were some burglaries in houses, but other than that, there hadn't been any murder in Newtown, Connecticut since 1975.
Most of the residents in the community enjoyed a comfortable and privileged lifestyle.
People live there are professional, so many of them have nannies, servants, and they all commute.
One of those commuters was Hella Crafts.
Hella Crafts is a 39-year-old airline flight attendant. She worked for Pan American Airlines, married to a pilot, Richard Crafts. She was your typical working mother in the 1980s who wanted to have it all. The family, the career, the lovely house, the wonderful husband.
The couple had first met in 1969 at an airline convention in Miami. After 6 years, they got married. They settled into the quiet New England community of Newtown and started to raise a family.
Looks like a perfect marriage. Richard very active in community affair. He also a part-time police officer in the local police department. And he also goes to school, talk to the kids.
His job as an auxiliary policeman in Newtown would have been to check vacant houses, people were on vacation, do non-traditional law enforcement work, direct traffic, if needed, assist at motor vehicle accident scenes.
Hallie is very nice or warm individual, and all the neighbors and community like her very much.
A lovely person, a mom, a caring mom, a working mom, who really doted on her children.
Helly and Richard had 3 children. They were here in Newtown schools. Occasionally their parents would come to school for career day, and they would be the flight attendant and the pilot.
To help with raising their children, they hired a live-in nanny, Dawn Marie Thomas.
She was employed by Mrs. Crafts, principally because Hella traveled a lot because of her job, and Richard traveled a lot because of his job.
The 18th of November, 1986. Late in the evening, Hella Crafts returned to Newtown after a long flight from Frankfurt.
She arrived at JFK Airport, and then her and another flight attendant drove back to Helly's house.
According to her colleagues, Hella was excited to be home for Thanksgiving.
The house was lit up, and she said, "Oh, Richard's home," and ran in.
The children were there, Richard was there, they were starting to have dinner, and then it started to snow.
As night fell, a massive snowstorm descended on Newtown and the surrounding area.
Uncharacteristic snowstorm for that time in November. Very wet snow, power went out, widespread power outage in the Newtown area.
The next morning, Richard Crafts woke to discover that Hella had already left for work. With the power still off, Crafts woke the children and the nanny, Dawn Marie.
Richard Kraft wake her up and ask her to hurry, take all the kids to his sister's house. Nanny apparently asked Richard, "Where's Mrs. Kraft?"
He said Helly Crafts had gotten out of bed, gotten dressed, taken her flight bags, and left the house an hour earlier.
Richard dropped Dawn Marie and the children at his sister Karen's house in neighboring Westport, where they still had power. Telling his sister that he'd be back later for the children, he then returned to his house in Newtown to check on the electricity. Later that day, the blackout ended. Richard picked up his children and went back to their house. There was no word from Hella.
So we know Helen was alive when her colleague dropped her in front of the house. We know she disappeared when the nanny wake up. So that period of time, nobody knows where she is.
And that was the last time anyone had seen her.
No trail. Just disappeared out of thin air.
The 20th of November. 2 days had passed since Hella Crafts had last been seen. When she didn't show up for work, her colleague Trudy Horvath called Richard to see if he'd heard from his wife. Crafts told her Hella had phoned from Europe.
He said that she went to Denmark because her mother was sick.
And that Helly was going to see her for a few days. This is what he told the live-in babysitter, Dawn Marie Thomas, and he also told the children.
Crafts mentioned that Hella had taken her flight luggage and that her car was parked in the Pan Am employees' car park where she always left it before a flight.
And a couple of her belongings were found in the back, a pair of boots that she was wearing when she returned from Germany the day before.
But when the car remained there untouched for another 3 days, Hella's friends became concerned.
She didn't come back and get it. They kept wondering why the car was still there, but no Hella. So they began to wonder about where she was.
We learned that it would have been uncharacteristic for her, predicated on her past behavior and associations with her friends, for her to just disappear.
Afraid that something may have happened to her, Hella's friends filed an official missing persons report. News of Hella's disappearance then reached the local media.
I was the crime reporter at the time. I covered the department. And at that point, they weren't saying much. You know, it was an ongoing investigation. So all we really knew was that Helly Crafts was a flight attendant. She was missing. She was the mother of 3 children. Newtown, Connecticut's a very quiet place. Not a lot crime-wise goes on here. So when all of a sudden we have a missing mother of 3, it was quite startling.
Hella's friends thought that she was a wonderful woman, obviously, a good mom, a hard worker, good wife, who was busy raising a family in Newtown.
But behind the veneer of a happy marriage, there was more to the story.
Underneath, a big storm and current going on, most of people doesn't know.
Richard Crafts had an extramarital affair for over 20 years with a particular flight attendant. So it wasn't something that just showed up. It was sort of a part of who he was. He had always had other relationships with other women over long term.
Just 3 months prior to her disappearance, Hella Crafts had hired a divorce lawyer called Diane Anderson.
It was at the urging of Diane Anderson for Hella to hire a private investigator to help her document the fact that Richard was in fact having an affair.
Anderson put Heller in touch with a private investigator called Keith Mayo. He agreed to follow Richard Crafts and to catch him in the act.
Keith apparently followed Richard and took some civilian photograph, saw Richard and some other lady, so he gave those photographs to Heller.
Devastated by the photographs, Heller decided to serve Richard with divorce papers. Crafts refused to accept the divorce.
But he did not allow the sheriff to serve him with divorce papers. He kept making excuses, made an appointment to be served the papers, and then didn't show up. So, he wasn't making it really easy for her. So obviously there was, some issue with not wanting to get divorced. He was concerned that he wouldn't see his children.
Heller was also worried about their children. She agreed to discuss the divorce with Richard when she returned from Frankfurt. But what actually happened when Heller returned would become one of the most shocking crimes in the history of Connecticut. 1986, Newtown, Connecticut. Air stewardess Heller Crafts went missing during a severe snowstorm. A week had passed since anyone had seen or heard from her. Her friends began to suspect the worst.
Heller disappeared under strange circumstances. They didn't want to believe that she wasn't alive, but nonetheless, the disappearance was under very mysterious circumstances.
Heller's husband, Richard Crafts, told her friends that she was safely in Denmark, visiting her sick mother. Lena Johansson, a friend of Heller's, decided to check out Richard's story.
Lena Johansson called Denmark to talk to Mrs. Nielsen, who was Heller Crafts' mother. And what Lena had learned is that Mrs. Nielsen wasn't ill, and also that she hadn't spoken to Heller Crafts in several weeks.
Richard's obvious lie about the trip to Denmark made Heller's friends all the more suspicious.
They were increasingly alarmed by her not responding to their calls and by her husband's making excuses about where she was.
Heller Crafts' friends didn't really like Richard, especially after Heller Crafts disappeared. They were very suspect of him.
They had a mixed opinion. They didn't quite like him. They didn't trust him. But they didn't know why. Something elusive.
For Thanksgiving, Richard and the three children spent the weekend with Richard's sister Karen and her family. Heller's friends were now even more suspicious because Heller had always celebrated the holiday.
Her friends were speculating that something bad happened to her because of discussions that Mrs. Kraft allegedly had with some of her friends.
She began to tell friends things like, she thought Richard might be angry at her, and also that if she should disappear or if anything should happen to her, not to assume it was an accident. When she did disappear, that phrase, if anything should happen to me, don't assume it's an accident, came back to haunt them.
Heller's friends told the police what she had said to them. Those investigating her disappearance decided to question her husband.
Richard Crafts was approached by one of my colleagues in the early part of December and asked, "Where's your wife? There are a lot of people who are suggesting that something could have happened to her, that she's missing. Is she missing?" He just maintained the same story that he had told other investigators, that his wife just simply got up and left the house on November 19th.
Not satisfied with his response, the police asked Crafts to take a lie detector test. He agreed.
It was an extensive examination administered by the Connecticut State Police, 2 polygraph examiners. It probably took between 2 to 3 hours, and they asked him questions relative to the disappearance of his wife. He passed the polygraph test with no deception, according to the polygraph examiners. I talked to the 2 examiners after. They told me that they were pretty sure that he didn't know the whereabouts of his wife, and they suggested that we look in other directions.
Although he passed the polygraph test, Crafts admitted that he'd made up the story about Heller going to visit her sick mother.
Many people asked Richard eventually, well, why did you tell all these different stories about the whereabouts of your wife? And his response was, well, I didn't want to air my dirty laundry about my marriage because it's really no one's business.
He didn't want people to know that she had left him and left the children.
With Richard Crafts cleared of being a possible suspect, the Newtown police broadened the scope of the investigation. The state police were brought in, and also the chief of forensic laboratories, Dr. Henry Lee.
I was the chief criminalist for the state of Connecticut. I was contacted. The forensic laboratory got involved in assisting investigation. So the case now, we have a task force to work on the case. He passed the polygraph a couple of times and really no place to go. We decide to put the case together.
Missing persons are basically investigated the same way. You gather all the information you can about the person who's missing. You gather financial data, credit card data, places where the person might go, friends, associates, and you go from there, tracking down that kind of information.
Two weeks had passed since Heller had last been seen alive. Investigators worked hard following leads and gathering clues.
There was a lot of information coming into police headquarters relative to the disappearance of Hella Crafts. There were extensive interviews done with Hella's friends and family, either by myself or the other investigators who were working the case.
And they also started interviewing neighbors, looking into financial records to see if Helly's credit card had been used anywhere, if she'd been making any phone calls. Back then in the 1980s, we had those calling cards, So see if there was any activity on those, and there was no activity for Hella Crafts.
Despite the hard work, the investigation revealed no solid leads. Meanwhile, the police were aware that the more time passed, the more likely it was that something bad had happened to Heller. Finally, there was a break in the case. Private investigator Keith Mayo and the Crafts nanny, Dawn Marie Thomas, approached the police with a stunning revelation.
Ms. Thomas told investigators that she had seen some stains on a carpet and that Mr. Crafts had subsequently removed a carpet from the Crafts' bedroom.
Richard Crafts became the investigation's prime suspect. Could he be responsible for the disappearance and murder of his own wife? December 1986. In the Connecticut town of Newtown, the police were investigating the sudden disappearance of Hella Crafts, who went missing on the night of the 18th of November during a snowstorm. Central to the investigation was Hella's husband, Richard Crafts.
She had been missing since November 19th. She had missed the Thanksgiving dinner with the family. So it had been a few weeks since she had last been seen, and they were getting concerned as to her whereabouts.
Although he allegedly passed the polygraph examination, there were still questions that were no answers for. Why would a mother get up and just leave without saying goodbye to her children? People were wondering, how could such a lovely woman with children just disappear without contacting anyone?
Dawn Marie Thomas, the Crafts' live-in nanny, came forward with some startling news. She claimed to have seen dark stains on the couple's bedroom carpet that Richard Crafts later removed.
And when she asked Richard Crafts what that stain was, he said it was from the kerosene heater. During Storm Carl, the electricity went out. He had taken 2 kerosene heaters out of the garage and brought them into the house, one in the master bedroom. He said the heater had spilled the kerosene and that he was, trying to, clean up the mess.
He told investigators that he had taken the carpet out of his home, but had put it in a landfill in Newtown. He didn't deny that he removed it. He cut the carpet in 2 foot strips because it was easier to remove that way, and took the carpet to the landfill.
Private investigator Keith Mayo decided to test out Richard's story by finding the carpet.
We went to the dump to look for the carpet. An entire day of this big dump.
And found the carpet in the landfill. The carpet was turned over to the investigative team who took the carpet to the lab, the forensic science laboratory, and submitted for analysis. It was nothing on the carpet to suggest that there was any trace evidence, blood, or any other substance that could link the carpet to Mrs. Crafts or to Mr. Crafts, for that matter.
Despite the setback, Keith Mayo continued to try to persuade the police that Richard Crafts was responsible for Hella's disappearance.
He was insistent that Richard had killed his wife and that the police should do something about it immediately.
Once he got involved in it, he wouldn't give up. He felt the main reason the cops pursued it. He was the reason that this case got going.
The police focused their investigation on Crafts' financial records.
We were working with credit card companies trying to determine if he had made any purchases, odd purchases, in the weeks following his wife's disappearance.
The first thing that Newtown police found was that he had charged some bedding to a Caldors in Brookfield. He had bought some pillows and a new comforter, which was kind of unusual. He did it the day after the storm, so that was kind of odd.
But the most telling evidence was yet to come.
One of my investigators, working with a credit card company, discovered that Mr. Crafts had rented a Woodchipper during the storm, the November 18, 1920 storm. And that immediately raised our suspicions even more that something terrible had happened.
But now, of course, he had rented equipment. And he had got a freezer, Woodchipper machine, a U-Haul, none of they've ever since.
So the Newtown Police Department was really setting the groundwork for an investigation into a homicide.
The paper trail from Crafts' unusual purchases was enough to convince a judge to sign a search warrant.
As the bedding factored in, as the Woodchipper factored in, building the probable cause for the search warrant was moving ahead.
The 25th of December, Christmas Day. Richard Crafts and his 3 children were on holiday in Florida. Investigators chose that moment to search Crafts' house.
The reason we picked Christmas time, we don't want to embarrass, the kids, make them feel bad, and they already suffer through loss of mother, and also we don't want the neighbor, I tell the detective, let's play low-key.
When the police arrived, the house was in disarray.
Carpets had been torn up. Furniture was all askew in different bedrooms. They found some things that had been burned in the fireplace. It wasn't what you'd expect to find in a family home.
So we found 2 single bedrooms. One from the kids' room, one from another spare room. And we found a king-size mattress was put on the side. I was able to put it back. When we put it back, we found some blood spatter on the mattress. Near the end where the babysitter noticed have some dark stain.
Investigators immediately took a sample from the blood-stained mattress for forensic analysis.
The types of forensic tests that Dr. Lee and his team would have done in the house might have included a presumptive test for blood, especially the blood splattering that they found on the mattress. They would also look for blood in places like down the drains, in a tub or a sink. They would use luminol on the walls to see if there was blood splatter there as well. These kind of tests were still up and coming back then, 20 years ago.
Early days in that time, DNA technology wasn't mature yet. However, we can tell that's male blood or female blood through DNA analysis. We was able to prove those are female.
They knew it was an O type. They knew that Hellicrafts had O blood.
What we recovered in the bedroom, the matches alone, give us a clue something have to have a medium force, impact force to get those spatter, to produce those spatter. So when the hit will produce some spatter down under this corner of the bed.
With the search complete, the police took stock of their case against Richard Crafts. Despite the growing list of physical evidence, they were still facing an enormous challenge.
The police didn't have a lot to go on. Their sole motive was that Helly had wanted a divorce as far as Richard was concerned. They had no murder weapon. They had no crime scene. They had no witnesses.
And they had no sign of the victim.
When Hellicraft first disappeared, we think have all 3-4 possibilities. First, run away. Second, kidnapped. Third, some accident happened. Fourth, she been murdered. If she was murdered, where's the body? When we search their house, we look at the refrigerator, we even look at the septic tank, every place. We did not find her body.
As more time passed and still no sign of Hella, local residents began to fear the worst.
The Newtown community really wanted Mrs. Crafts to reappear. It was a bedroom community, and murders just didn't happen there.
The 29th of December, a break in the case. A snowplow driver called Joseph Hine came forward with the revelation that on the night of the 19th of November, he'd seen someone out alone in strange circumstances.
Mr. Hine saw a man in the middle of a storm. It was very strange.
He saw a Woodchipper machine on the bridge over the Housatonic River. And Richard Crafts was working.
It was either very late at night or early in the morning. Just no one was out. There was no power. The only vehicles out were highway department vehicles. You would have taken your life in your hands going in. So that's why it was very strange.
Hine was convinced that the man with the woodchipper was Richard Crafts.
Hine even said Mr. Crafts, as Mr. Hine's plow approached, Mr. Crafts just motioned for Mr. Hine to go around.
He finally crafted the Woodchipper again toward dawn. He was still working. Hine found this very suspicious.
Mr. Hine's story was very important because it put Mr. Crafts on the steel bridge.
Hine told the police that Crafts was pointing the woodchipper towards Lake Zor below the bridge.
We want to know where's the body. Through the witness statement, we think the most likely place is the Lake Zor.
The investigators immediately jumped into action.
They brought in the Major Crime Squad van, and they started to sift through all these piles of wood chips that they had found along the edge of Lake Zor. They had erected a tent village where people from the Major Crime Squad were working and sifting through the leafy mud.
The local media got wind of the discovery.
I had gone down to Lake Zor early on in the investigation. It was interesting to watch because they were working furiously.
You stand there for 5-10 hours, complete frozen, looking for clue. Took us days and days and in this cold weather.
The hard work paid off for Dr. Lee and the rest of the state police forensic team.
We found 56 little bone chips, 2,660 hairs. We found a tooth. That tooth have special dental work. In addition, we found a dental crown. We found half of the toenail and part of the finger. Less than 3 ounces of human material. That's how we put the case together and to prove, first of all, the person missing. That's the remains of a person.
The investigators had enough evidence to solve the mystery of what had happened to Helle Crafts.
Now, for the first time, they had a body.
Now we can positively say Helle Crafts was murdered.
A careful examination of the bone fragments revealed how Helle's killer had disposed of her remains.
When we study those bone chips, we just can't come up with an ordinary instrument can produce that kind of chips. Only the commercial woodchipper.
At the lab, Dr. Lee and his team analyzed each and every item gathered at the crime scene.
We was able to compare these two sources here, hair from the hairbrush and the hair from the riverbank. The hair, when we look at it, had been bleached and dyed. That 2,660 hair found in the riverbank, it's also bleached and dyed. Have a traumatic stress on the hair, which means this hair went through the woodchipper.
Investigators continued to comb the surrounding shoreline of Lake Zor for more evidence.
There was shredded mail found in the vicinity where Mr. Hine had seen Mr. Crafts. And the mail happened to be correspondence from Mrs. Crafts' mother.
We found some fabric. It's blue-green. According to the babysitter, that's her favorite nightgown. That letter we think probably in her nightgown pocket, so chopped up with that. We found portion of a toenail with pink nail polish. We found all the nail polish from her house. We was able to identify that from one of the bottle.
Dr. Lee and his team took stock of the long list of physical evidence.
We was able to link the hair together. We linked the tooth together. We linked the bone together. I was able to link the wood chips together.
At the crime scene, police divers made a crucial discovery at the bottom of Lake Zor.
This diving team found a chainsaw.
When the divers brought the saw to the surface, it was later examined by forensic people. I think there was human tissue on the chainsaw.
But on the chainsaw, inside the motor area, have a lot of grease. All those grease really helping us, all those debris, the bone chips, tissue, hair, fiber, all stick on the grease.
Although the serial number had been removed, the police were able to restore it and trace the chainsaw back to where it had been purchased.
To Newtown chainsaw store. We talked to the owner. He said, well, I have a receipt in the shoebox. Visa, $499 for that chainsaw. Richard Crafts on it. The serial number, E0371616. Always remember, because when I found that number, it's the excitement you found this clue. That clue link this chainsaw to Richard Kraft. It's a major breakthrough.
Investigators now had enough evidence to charge Richard Crafts with the murder of his wife.
I think the finding of the body parts was the sealed the deal as far as his arrest was concerned. They now had a body. You have to remember that there had never been an arrest, let alone a conviction, in the state of Connecticut or even in the United States without a body. You always needed a body in a homicide to prove that there was a death.
The 13th of January. The authorities moved in on the Crafts' residence to make the arrest. The police had to exercise extreme caution.
You know, he felt that Richard had done harm to his wife, then he was also concerned for other residents in the house.
On the 13th of January 1987, the state police were moments away from arresting Richard Crafts for the murder of his wife. At midnight, they surrounded his home.
Well, they went to his house, they asked him to come out, and he wouldn't do it.
Half an hour passed. The police knew Kraft's 3 young children were in the house with him. It was critical that a confrontation was avoided.
But eventually, he did come out.
The police made sure that the children were unharmed, and then they took Kraft into custody.
And brought him over to Troop A in Southbury, where he spent the night being processed. And then in the morning, they took him over to the Danbury Superior Court for his arraignment.
News of the arrest spread quickly to the local community and the rest of the world.
Back in the 1980s, it wasn't the 24/7 news machine that we have today. There was no Fox News Channel or CNN. And this case really sparked that kind of coverage here in Connecticut. So when it finally broke and Richard was arrested, the media descended on Newtown, Connecticut from all over the world, from Denmark, from New York City, from all over Connecticut. And it was just this huge media circus.
A trial date was set in nearby New London.
I think that every major newspaper and probably some minor publications in Connecticut covered the trial pretty thoroughly.
The prosecution had an enormous amount of evidence to present.
This is the most lengthy investigation we ever conducted at that time. A lot of physical evidence. DNA, typing, blood grouping, hair comparison, tool mark comparison, fabric comparison, handwriting analysis. I think I testified for 6 days consecutively, because this case I did a lot of investigation, a lot of laboratory work, and a lot of reconstruction.
The first trial took 4.5 months. There were hundreds of witnesses, almost thousands of pieces of evidence and documents that were put into evidence. And it was very painstakingly presented. There was just so much going on, but it started to drag on. It really was a long drain.
4 months into the lengthy proceedings, the trial was suddenly thrown into crisis.
It went into 17 days of deliberations, which was also the longest in state history. One juror refused to deliberate anymore because he was voting for an acquittal. And as far as he was concerned, nothing was going to change his mind.
Tonight, he had apparently had it. At dinner time, saying of the jury room, "I'm out of there and I'm not going back in there." He said he would not enter unless carried in.
The judge hearing the case was forced to declare a mistrial. A second trial was ordered in Norwalk, also in Connecticut, but far enough from Newtown to avoid a jury being prejudiced by all the previous media attention.
There were TV stations there, obviously, with their cameras rolling. There were radio stations. There were a lot of newspaper reporters from all over the state of Connecticut. There wasn't a lot of independent thinking, I think, among the media. I feel that they were all out to, get Richard, and he was guilty, and they were just going to present that side of the story.
The 7th of September 1989. The second trial went ahead without interruption. Despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against Richard Crafts, the prosecution was facing an enormous challenge.
The reconstruction of the murder of Hella Crafts was really difficult because there was no crime scene, there was no murder weapon, there were no witnesses. So it was pure speculation on the part of the prosecution as to what really happened.
Prosecuting lawyer Walter Flanagan recreated the crime for the jury.
Hella returned from her trip either that night or early the next morning. Hella and Richard argued, probably over the pending divorce. Richard assaulted her in the house, probably killed her in the house.
what we suspect, Hella was hit with something, a blunt object. Richard is pretty strong.
He hit her in the head with a hammer and then wrapped in the carpet.
Of course, Hella's body was down on the floor on the carpet. The pool of blood, that's what Maria probably noticed. When he finally found out, it's impossible to clean the blood, so he took the whole carpet, rolled up and dumped away. Now, of course, you have a body. Where are you going to hide the body?
Carried it to the backyard where he put it into a freezer, where she sat for a full day.
Because a fresh body, when you cut, pretty difficult with a chisel. Once it froze, you can cut in sections.
On the morning of the 19th of November, with the power still off, Crafts drove Dawn Marie and the children to his sister's house. He then spent the day preparing to dispose of his wife's remains.
Supposed to pick them up 2 o'clock afternoon sometime. And he did not pick them up until that night.
In the meantime, we went out and rented a Woodchipper machine and a U-Haul. Came back to his house, took her out of the freezer, put her inside this machine and drove out into the night. So there was nothing, no evidence there, no blood, nothing.
It was the perfect cover for what he did. In his mind, he thought that there's no oddity in me having a wood chipper because I've had it before, I've rented it before, there's a paper trail. People know that I do lot clearing, so it would not be uncommon for me to have a wood chipper.
And he'd not been seen that night in the bridge. It could have worked.
The courtroom listened to the horrific details in shocked silence. Richard Crafts remained unmoved.
Richard's demeanor in court I would characterize as being the same as it always been. Very low-key, very nonchalant.
And he was cool during the whole thing. Never showed any emotions.
After less than 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict.
And the second time, the jury found him guilty.
He showed no reaction whatever. Not a smile, not a frown, nothing, just sat there.
Just same way as he always was. Very calm, cool, and collected.
The 20th of November 1989, Richard Crafts was found guilty of first-degree murder.
Richard Crafts was sentenced to 50 years in prison, and at the time in the state of Connecticut, there was no allowance for paroles.
3 years after the disappearance of Hella Crafts, the community reacted to the news of the guilty verdict.
Although it took 2 trials to convict him, I think justice was still served.
Richard Crafts today lives in the state of Connecticut. He's up at the Summers Correctional Institute.
He's still in maximum security jail. It's kind of a horrible place. It's huge, this jail.
The case was to have a lasting impact on the residents of Newtown and on all those who worked so hard to bring justice to the name and memory of Hella Crafts.
The Richard Crafts murder trial was a case of a lifetime for a journalist. It was high profile, it was groundbreaking, it was historic. And as a young journalist, for me, it was a wonderful opportunity to really, do some great work, journalistically speaking. I tried really hard to be very objective and to present both sides, which, is difficult in an intricate case like this.
It also shows us the value of scientific evidence. Even little tiny trace evidence, a single hair, can give us a story. Work on almost 8,000 major cases. This is a case I always remember.
I think I remember what everyone else remembers, is that how could anybody murder your wife and put her through a wood chip? It's just unbelievable. And what always pops into my mind about this case is a snowstorm in a beautiful small New England community, and all spoiled by a murder.